All right, we're going to take a look at the distribution of wealth during the early Middle Ages, during the age of feudalism in Europe. But we're also going to take a look at the distribution of wealth in the United States today and make a comparison. So let's get started. Let's begin with a definition of plutocracy. Plutocracy is a government by the wealthy. It's when the wealthy class is going to exercise control of political power through direct or indirect means. The direct means might be they actually become politicians and get elected to office, and the indirect means may be that they actually influence it through the economy as businesses, and maybe even have lobbyists that lobby government. Now, this process of plutocracy is very similar to feudalism during the Middle Ages, and these pictures on the right sort of illustrate that plutocracy has been around for a while. It actually existed in ancient Roman society and maybe even in ancient Athens, but clearly during the Middle Ages it was part of the economic and political system. It also kind of reflects what happened in America at the turn of the last century with the age of robber barons. And many people have argued that it reflects what's going on today when we look at the power and wealth of CEOs who run corporate America and how they influence the way our government functions through lobbying. So let's take a quick review then at what we looked at earlier in another screencast on the feudal social structure. What we know is that there's the king at the top, followed by the noble and church officials, and then the knights, all of whom are part of the vassal class who show loyalty to the king in exchange for land grants. And then the vast majority of the people, 90% of the population, are peasants or serfs. So we know that there's this sort of hierarchical system in the Middle Ages where there's a very few people at the top and a lot of people at the bottom. So let's take a closer look at how that distribution might look. For instance, during the early Middle Ages, wealth and power was concentrated in a small percentage of the population. That's about 10% estimate. So that top 10% of feudal society, kings, nobles, church officials, and knights, controlled the majority of the wealth. The other 90% of the population were the peasants and serfs, who of course had to work in the fields, and many were actually tied to the land. So 10% of the population at the top controls most of the wealth, and 90% of the population lives and works in servitude to that 10%. Now, let's take a quick look then at the distribution of wealth in the United States up to the year 2007. At the top, we have the top 1% of the population. That's followed by the next 4% of the population, which is then followed by the next 5% of the population, then the next 10% of the population, and then the bottom 80% of the population. So this is going to be our hierarchical breakdown of American society in 2007. So what does this actually look like? Let's look at the top 1%. This is the super rich. They actually control 43% of financial wealth in this country. That's followed by the next 4%, which we'll call wealthy, and they control 29% of the financial wealth. That's then followed by the next 5%, which we call the upper class, which has 11% of financial wealth. Now, if you can combine these three groups together, you'll see that it adds up to 10% of the population. But this 10% of our population in the United States controls 83% of all the wealth in this country. Now, what about that next 10%? That's what we call the middle class. And the middle class only controls about 10% of the financial wealth in this country. That means that we have the bottom 80%, which is made up of the working class and the poor, having only 7% of the financial wealth. If you add the middle class and the working class and poor together, it only totals 17% of the wealth. All right, so this is a system that you can see, a plutocracy, in which the wealthy are basically in control of what goes on. What makes that possible is that they control, in our country, 83% of the wealth, whereas the remaining part of the population only has 17%. Now, take a look at this in another way. The top 10% control 83% of all the financial wealth. That's more than the bottom 90% combined. What that means is that the bottom 90% have to share that 17% of the remaining wealth. So this is a system that's based on inequality, that basically a very small percentage of the population at the top, 10%, controls 83% of the wealth, the majority of the wealth. All right, so go back to feudal Europe and take a look at this chart, and we can see that it's very similar. In fact, about 10% of the population of Europe, which was made up of the nobles and the vassal class, basically controlled the majority of the wealth, and the peasants and serfs had little or no wealth at all. Now, if I compare that again to the United States, it doesn't really change that much. Again, the top 10% of America controls 83% of the wealth, and the bottom 90% only have 17%. So you should note that nothing has really changed that much since the Middle Ages. The distribution of wealth, both in the past and in the current system that we have in the United States, looks an awful lot like plutocracy or feudalism. Let's take that one step further. Let's look at the super rich. That's the top 1% of people in the United States of America. They alone control 43% of the wealth. That means that the remaining 99% of the population has to share the 57% of the wealth that's left. That's a very sort of uneven distribution of wealth that clearly favors the top 1% of the rich, the super rich. These are people that are extremely rich. These are not the people that you're used to seeing on television or in magazines. These people are very, very wealthy. All right, so let's take a look at this. If that's the unequal distribution of wealth that exists in our country, why isn't it that more people aren't upset? Well, part of it has to do with how they think about it. So there's the ideal, the estimated, and the real wealth distribution that people consider. So this chart below shows us the ideal. This is what people would like it to be. This is what they would like the distribution of wealth to be. And this is spread out across, over here, you got the top 20% in gray, the second highest 20% are this sort of light pink, the middle 20% are in this reddish area, the second lowest 20% are in this next reddish area, and the bottom 20% are in that dark red. So based on this chart, it would appear that people would like to see wealth more equally distributed. Not taking all the wealth from the rich. You can see they have a fairly large section here. It's almost 30%, about 32% of the control of wealth. All right, and then of course the second highest 20% has about 25% of that control. The next highest, the middle 20%, basically has about 20% control. And then the second lowest 20% has about maybe 15%. And then the bottom 20% have about 10%. This is what Americans believe the ideal would be like. In a capitalist society, they know that the distribution of wealth won't be equitable, but this would be somewhat fair in the minds of most Americans. Now, this is what people think it is. So this is the estimated distribution of wealth. This is what people think it really is. So the bottom chart is the ideal. It's what they'd like it to be. And this chart in the middle here is the one that people think actually reflects reality. And you can see that people think that the rich have much more than they probably deserve, and that the rest of us sort of have to share what's left. But keep in mind, this is an estimate. This is what people think it is. So let's take a look at what it actually is. Now you can see there's a huge difference here. It looks and it shows that about 83% of the wealth in this gray area right here is in the hands of the top 20% of the population. And then if you look, the next 20% down has about maybe 10%. And then at the bottom, right, we got here, and this is the middle 20%, looks like about maybe 5%. But what you need to pay attention to is what it says at the bottom of the chart here. In the actual line, the bottom two quintiles are not visible because the lowest quintile owns just 0.1% of all wealth, and the second lowest quintile owns 0.2%. So what that means is the bottom 20% and the second lowest 20%, these two groups right here, only own combined about 0.3% of the wealth. That would suggest that when we talk about poverty in America, the poor are really poor. And in this case, based on this actual chart, the wealthy are extremely wealthy. Again, 83% of the wealth is in the hands of a small percentage of our population.